doing deals and bringing up the kind of American commercial pioneering ideal is where we're headed. So maybe you could say that maybe, I don't know, a few years from now, you could say what we're for is doing business. And we're for doing business in a meaningful way in African markets by American standards like FCPA and other level of, doing clean, transparent business. Because we could say for a long time that other countries were about doing business, and I'm not sure the US was. So I'm just saying maybe we're getting to a point where we can say more about what we're for, and it might shift away from the traditional kind of democracy promotion, civil society to one more of mutual benefit in business. And maybe
but Aubrey, these are not separate categories. And I think that's one of the key flaws of just focusing on trade and investment, because if you are going to invest in an African country, in theory, you would like it to be stable and secure. You would like to have, or to know that when you push a transaction through, that the judiciary is going to fairly adjudicate any sort of issues that you have, that there will be legislative oversight, that the press will bring out any sort of malfeasance, and that development is one way in which you help create and buttress a consuming class. So I think that one of the faults of this approach is that this doesn't happen in a vacuum. You can't just focus on deals and pretend that the enabling environment is secondary. And you and I have had this conversation. Prosper Africa is nowhere when it comes to enabling environment. Yeah, it's sort of hidden in some speeches, but that's not where the line of effort is. And it has to be married together.
I'm going to quote that. Bring the US into direct competition with China, because I mean, that's China's whole thing is, non-ingérence. We do our business, we make money, everyone makes money, it's gagne, gagne.
No, they're not going to be in direct competition with the Chinese because we don't sell anything that the Chinese sell for the most part. We're not direct competitors with the Chinese. We don't manufacture cell phones. We're not doing infrastructure. We're not doing the things that they're doing. We're a services-based economy. I'm going to go back to one very important point, and this is from the book of Judd Devermont, chapter 1 on U.S. foreign policy, which says that the United States can no longer be all things to all people. And I think the first kind of discussion that if we got one of those kind of like those off-site meetings where you get all the executives into a room and you come up with next year's strategy, is to get all the key principles into a room and say, pick 5 things that you're going to focus on. Because the days of us doing democracy, economy, security, culture, everything are over. And I think we're going to have to pick our areas of specialization. The problem is that is a non-starter in Washington and not there. You guys are there. We still think, everything we do is great. And we're not that good at a lot of things. And that's a hard conversation to have with Americans. And the problem is in Africa, people don't take us seriously. Because at the end of the day, the average Nigerian, Ivorian, South African, 17, 18-year-old will touch a part of China 12 to 15 times a day. From the phone, the road they use, the pot, the tea kettle that they use to heat their water in the morning, to the bus that they're driving. They don't touch anything American throughout their day.
But maybe
that is the reality.
But maybe they do from a aspiration perspective, because the average American touches more things made in China every day, and
that's right. But I don't think people look to the United States, especially today, in any aspirational way.
So I don't think the polling doesn't show that, Eric. Right? The polling shows that
it shows close. A trend, a downward trend. We've seen the latest Pew numbers came out, and Trump has had a very serious impact on that.
So if the new series of Afrobarometer polling will come out very soon, and it actually shows a fairly consistent score line, which means that we are just barely north of the Chinese. And I think it's an important reckoning is that the Chinese are also popular. And we can talk about the economics as well. A friend of mine, Colin Hendricks, has a great paper where he shows it's not a zero sum. When China does well in terms of selling, actually we do well as well. We actually follow the same curves. They're just at a different scale. And I want Aubrey to weigh in and correct everything that we've said, but just since you quoted the book of Judd, let me just make sure that I'm clear. There's definitely a footnote that says we don't abandon democracy, development, security, or economics, but it's within those segments that I think that we're overly invested, and so we are not prioritizing. Because I think that these are all linked, but we can't sell roads in Africa, and perhaps we should be more focused on the democracy investments that we make or the development investments we make. That's just my one sort of quibble with the Book of Judd.
Fair enough.
Well, Judd can definitely always quibble with the Book of Judd. That's your benefit there. I mean, before Eric quoted you, I was about to say, I have a brilliant friend who says you can't, if you have so many priorities, you have no priorities. So, my view on all the other things, democracy, promotion, rule of law, obviously those things are important. However, I believe that the course of economic history in whether it's the US or whether it's Europe or whether it's India or China shows that the business community plays a significant role in pushing institutions to become better. And the tension between a business community and their institutions helps to make for better governance. And so I would like to see, if we're talking about a prioritization, a strict prioritization and an order of operations, I'm for a business focus, because I think in doing so and building up the next generation of Dangotes, even more of them, taking the companies in African markets that are doing $1 billion in revenue and taking it from whatever it is today, which is like 450, I'm sure Acha and McKinsey will correct me to the exact number, but is going to be like to 1,000 to 2,000. We need the business community to become more robust, to continue to be an area of opportunity for young people to become wealthy, to become influential, to become role models, and not just become ministers you don't just become ministers to do those things. And the day when we have even more of those role models that care about their legacy and invest in local supply chains, that's when they push government at some point. At first, they're all oligarchs, right? We saw that in the United States in the 1880s. We've seen it in other countries. We've seen it in East Asia. And then at some point, they're like, you know what? We need government to work. This process, and there's a lot more, they become industry associations, et cetera. So I don't really think you can push necessarily great rule of law or create great institutions without business backing.
I mean, we've managed to avoid saying the word Thucydides, which is great. I'm not going to start now, but managing the rise of China is certainly going to be, the story of the next 20 years. Are you suggesting, or maybe I'm suggesting, that if both China, with its pretty clear business focus, if that same stance is taken by the US, as in, no, we're not going to talk about democracy, we are going to stay perhaps a more limited agenda focused around business, actually that might be the most stable way of managing the next few decades.
I mean, I don't think the US is ever going to say, like, we're not going to care about rule of law or transparency. With American business comes transparency and FCPA accordance and all the compliance levels that American business have to meet either by law or by the court of public opinion and the scrutiny that American brands get. Look at the scrutiny brands have gotten during this period of racial reckoning we're going through in the United States with Black Lives Matter and this movement. I mean, brands are sensitive to this. So when American companies do business in the region and investors invest, they're going to come with embedded values that reflect a lot of these things that will make it qualitatively different than Chinese investment, but maybe less conditional from the beginning. So I don't necessarily think that it's realistic to say that we're going to come without, we're not going to say like non-interference policy as the Chinese have. I just don't ever see that coming. Maybe Judd and Eric have a broader imagination than I do, but
I'm just trying to think of, and maybe Aubrey, you can shed some light on this. When you're talking about American business in Africa, who is the big, because it used to be an oil-driven business. That was the bulk of our trade, was resource extraction. We don't buy that much oil from Africa anymore. So when you talk about American business, who are you actually talking about?
That was always by value, right?
Value, that's right.
Oil, because oil skews the value. But
Correct.
in terms of American companies that have employed and been operational on the continent, you had that first wave, which came over 100 years ago or 60 years ago,
in the Goodyear and things like that. But today, what are we? Who are the big players in American business today?
Tech players coming, right? So you have Facebook and Google both investing in
that's still very, very small, relatively speaking, though.
Well, relative by value, again, yes, compared to global markets, but everything in Africa is small compared to global markets. And so you do see more interest by Visa, MasterCard, Facebook, Google, the kind of next wave of both fintech and tech players are interested. And then if you look at the $1.2 billion that were invested in venture last year, a lot of those funds are American tied in some way. Either they're started by diasporans who are dual citizens, they're American funds, they have ties to the Valley, American or European of some sort. So there were ties in the kind of tech ecosystem. We see Netflix doing more. So again, I'm not a believer that that there's enough US appetite or that there's been enough done to mobilize and educate American investors. I think there's a lot more that can be done, but I think it is wrong to say that they're not doing anything and that there's no American.
No, I wouldn't say that they're not doing anything. I just look at the scale of European players and Chinese players in Africa, and it seems of orders of magnitude larger and across so many different sectors, from apparel to agriculture to obviously extractives to tech. I mean, you look at a company like Boomplay with 63 million subscribers compared to Spotify and Apple. You look at Techno or Transsion, and it's going to be almost impossible for American companies to catch up because the first mover advantage is so significant. And the Chinese are very big in the fintech space as well. So it's a wonderfully crowded market in Nigeria right now, which is very exciting. But at the same time, I think when we're talking about the US, they're really a secondary player and maybe a tertiary player.
I think only by trend line. If you look at the Ernst & Young data on FDI investments over the years, the Chinese only surpassed Americans on FDI investors last year in 2019. And so US is just a significant FDI investor still. And there's a lot of cases of that. Cargill, ADM, there's a lot of players, Dole, Del Monte, a lot of players on the ground. It's just the trend line. The Chinese and others have been increasing theirs over time. And they're catching up rapidly and surpassing the same way that the Chinese did with hosting African students. And African students now studying, English-speaking African students, now more of them studying in China than in the US. So we're sitting on our laurels, and we've been, again, a little bit static in the trend line. The Chinese trend line is still accelerating, even though it's accelerating at a decreasing rate, because as China slows itself, and if you look at even the announcements that have come out of FOCAC, it's smaller every time or it's flatlined, right? But the trend line is still strategically for them increasing engagement commercially with the continent.
I just wanted to pick up on something that was mentioned earlier by you, I think, Aubrey, about the possibilities of supply chains in lithium, in graphite, perhaps also in rare earths. Can we see a future clash security-wise in terms of strategic minerals or minerals which may link into various strategic things? Is this a potential flashpoint in the years to come?
For me, it matters how serious we are about reshoring supply chains and how much we manage the rise of China. As I said, from a strategic imperative point of view, geopolitically long-term, the US has to figure out a way to coexist peacefully with a rising superpower, which, historically go back to your Greek wars. That's very difficult. And so that imperative is upon us. And if we want to or believe that we can have separate supply chains of key strategic value chains, then there would be conflict eventually. But I'm not sure that that's on the near-term horizon anytime soon.
Well, there is precedent for the Chinese cutting off the supply of rare earth to Japan when they had a dispute a few years ago. Rare earths is one area. I'm surprised, honestly, that the Pentagon still sources rare earths from China and has not been more active in Africa building out those supply chains. The coltan tantalum supply chains for electric vehicles in the eastern DRC are largely controlled by Chinese supply chains. It's going to be very, very difficult for Americans to try and get into that space.